Welcome, everyone. I'm Carrie Dorth, and I am the Director of Admissions here at Presidio Graduate School. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us today during your lunch hour, or whatever time it happens to be for you. Today's webinar, we're going to be presenting, the presentation will introduce some options for incorporating your environmental, social, government, and governance ESG principles in your investment choices. I am pleased to introduce our presenters today, Megan Morris, as well as Danielle Salel, and both are inspiring Presidio Graduate School alumni and work for HIP Investors. So I'll go ahead and just have them start their presentation. We'll have some time for some Q&A after the presentation, as well as there is a chat box in the center of the bottom of your screen. Feel free to go ahead and type questions in there. If you look on the left hand portion, there's going to be a microphone, a mute. We request that you do keep your microphone muted during the presentation. You can keep your video on or turn it off. It's your choice on that. And with that, we'll kind of just jump right in. Great.
Excellent. Thanks, Carrie. Well, for everyone who was here for the first one in June, welcome back. This is the second installation of our joint webinar series that we're doing with Presidio. The first is available to watch if anyone on this call missed it. That was an overview of impact investing, where we got into, some of the terminology. And so we went over a lot of tools that are available to screen your investments on several different criteria on the first one. And we are going to be completing the series with a viewer's choice. So if there's a topic that you really want to explore in depth, make sure you email one of us so we can include it in the survey. We're going to vote on what the final topic is going to be. And as Carrie mentioned, today we're covering how to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors across asset classes. So we're doing this webinar for educational purposes, and this should not be considered investment advice. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Normal disclosures here. Now I'm going to talk a bit about portfolio construction. So also on our last call, we went over an impact investing spectrum, and we spoke about how all investments can be examined in terms of their impact, risk, and return profiles. This is another example of an impact spectrum, and you can see how it moves from business as usual on the left side to impactful on the right side. And at Presidio, I know I spent a lot of time learning about great ideas on the right side of the spectrum, but unfortunately much of the financial services industry is still stuck far on the left. And at HIP Investor, a lot of what we do still actually falls on this left-hand side, where we look at, responsible investing, incorporating ESG screens, because there are a lot of, it's hard in the financial services industry. It's good to be differentiated, but it can be hard to actually be different, because people are pretty conservative with their money, and we want to make sure that we're moving people in a way that feels comfortable. And when we are working with large institutions, there are a lot of stakeholders that we have to convince and get on board. So this is the investment spectrum that I was talking about, showing business as usual to impact. And as I said, at Presidio, I spend a lot of time on the right-hand side of this, but unfortunately, a lot of the financial services industry is stuck on the left-hand side. So HIP Investor has been trying to create change in the financial services industry for the last 11 years. We have a rating system that looks at various investments, everything from stocks to municipal bonds, and rates them on their net impact. HIP ratings are an indicator of future risk and return potential. It was actually formed based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs with the underlying pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust. And you'll notice that's a different terminology than what we're talking about today on the call. We're using the terminology environmental, social, and governance. And sometimes we're asked why our pillars are different, and that's really just because this was created 11 years ago. So this was before a lot of people started to use ESG as their preferred terminology, but we still map our metrics into the ESG categories as well if there's an existing framework that somebody is working with. So since 1994, Dalbar's quantitative analysis of investor behavior has measured the effects of investor decisions to buy, sell, and switch into and out of mutual funds over short and long-term timeframes. The results consistently show that average investors earn less, and unfortunately, in many cases, much less than mutual performance reports would suggest. The goal of this analysis is to improve the performance of both independent investors and financial advisors by managing the behaviors that cause investors to act imprudently. So in 2014, the average equity mutual fund investor underperformed the S&P 500 by a wide margin of 8.19%. The broader market return was more than double the average equity mutual fund investors' return. It was actually 13.69% versus 5.5%. And in 2014, the average fixed income mutual fund investor underperformed the Barclays Aggregate Bond Index by a margin of 4.81. And this broader bond market returned 5 times over what the average fixed income mutual investor did. This slide here is showing the 2015 numbers, which are pretty similar. And basically what this slide is showing is that people, if you look at what the appropriate benchmark is that somebody is investing in, they're performing a lot worse than what that benchmark is telling them. And unfortunately, no matter what state of the mutual fund industry, whether we're in a boom like we are right now or a bust, the investment results are more dependent on investor behavior than on fund performance. Mutual fund investors who hold on to their investments have been much more successful than those who tried to time the market. So when discussing investor behavior, it's also helpful to first understand the specific thoughts and actions that can lead to poor decision-making. Investor behavior is not simply buying and selling at the wrong time. There are many other psychological traps, triggers, and misconceptions that cause investors to act irrationally. That irrationality leads to buying and selling at the wrong time, which leads to underperformance. Many people have heard that you want to buy low and sell high, but people tend to actually do the exact opposite of that. And there are many distinct behaviors that tend to plague investors based on their personal experiences. Investors tend to be optimistic and think that only good things will happen to them and bad things will happen to others. Herding can also be an issue when you copy the behavior of others, even in the face of unfavorable outcomes. Also, people tend to anchor their assumptions in what is familiar to them, even if it's not really appropriate or relevant to the current situation. This slide here is showing you one of these distinct behaviors, which is loss aversion. So losing $100 hurts twice as much as the feeling that you would experience by gaining $100. And many people expect to find high returns with low risk, but investors act much more strongly to avoid risk, even when it's not in their best long-term interest. So it's important to take the emotions out of your investment decisions and to stay the course that you have previously decided either by yourself or with your financial advisor. And there are ways that you can feel more actively involved in your investments. You do not want to make investment decisions when you're feeling an emotional response to what the market's currently doing. One important investment strategy is asset allocation, which aims to balance the risk and reward by apportioning portfolio's assets according to your own goals, risk tolerance, and investment horizon. So portfolios that are diversified across multiple asset classes and equity styles can help you maximize risk-adjusted returns. So two different types of management are passive management and active management. Passive investing is an investment strategy that tracks a market-weighted index or a portfolio. The most popular method is to mimic the performance of an externally specific index by buying an index fund. The benefits of passive investing are that you have very low fees. There's nobody that's picking those stocks, so the oversight is much less expensive. It simply follows the index they use as their benchmark. It's transparent. It's always clear which assets are being held in an index fund. They're tax efficient. The buy and hold strategy typically doesn't result in massive capital gains for the year. And proponents of active investing would say that passive investing is too limited because you are limited to just the funds in that specific index or whatever the predetermined set of investments is, with little to no variance and locked into those holding no matter what's going on in the market. And they would also say that you have less potential for returns because passive funds will pretty much never beat the market, even in times of turmoil, because their core holdings, as I said, are locked in to track the market. Sometimes a passive fund may beat the market by a little, but it's never going to post the large returns that active managers are going after. Active investing, on the other hand, refers to a portfolio management strategy where the manager makes specific investments with the goal of outperforming an investment benchmark index. So, it's very flexible. Active managers aren't required to follow a specific index. So they can buy those diamond in the rough stocks or move large portions of their portfolio to cash, depending on what the market's doing. They also have a hedging ability, so they can use various techniques like short selling or put options, and even just exit whole sectors or stocks completely if they think that the risks are too big. Passive managers, they are using already what the track holds, regardless of how those sectors are doing. And active investment also can have some tax management abilities. Even though you could trigger higher capital gains incidents, advisors can tailor tax management strategies to you. So they can do tax harvesting, which is actually where you sell investments that are losing money to offset the taxes that you have on the stocks that are doing well. So active management do have the shortcoming of being more expensive. Thomson Reuters pegs the average expense ratio at 1.4% for an actively managed equity fund, which is compared to only 0.6% for the average passive equity fund. And the fees are higher because of, the buying and selling triggers transaction costs, not to mention you're actually paying the salaries of the analyst and the fund managers and the people that are doing that stock picking. And also active managers, there's more active risk because active managers are free to buy any investment they think would bring high returns, which is great when the analysts are right, but not so great when the analysts are wrong. So back when Jack Bogle started the Vanguard 500 index in 1975, I'm sure that he would not foresee how successful Passive investing has become in the way that we invest, but now funds run by Vanguard, which is one of the, it's a giant index fund company, own at least 5% of 490 of the S&P 500 companies, which is up from 5% of just 115 of those companies 7 years ago. So index funds have become an increasing part of the landscape, as well as exchange traded funds. And it's really expanded beyond just the S&P 500 to cover almost every asset class. Today, you can put together a portfolio composed of just index funds and ETFs to create any market exposure that you want to, in stocks, bonds, or commodities. And the growth of passive investing can be seen here in this graph, which shows the proportion of US equity market held by passive investors, either in index funds or ETFs, and all active investors from 2005 to 2016. In 2016, passive invested accounted for approximately 40% of all institutional money in the equity market, which you can tell by just quickly glancing at the graph, it's more than doubled since 2005. So another study found that executives at companies and industries with high common ownership were paid 25% more than executives in industries with lower levels, and CEOs get most of those gains. CEO pay can jump up to 10 times for what it is for the other non-CEO executives, where you can, that's what this graph is showing, the increase in pay. Index fund ownership tends to lead to high executive compensation. And this compensation study also found that index fund ownership, as the index fund ownership as a company rises, the pay of their top executives was more closely tied to the performance of the industry than to their own company. So the higher the level of passive ownership, the study found, the more of a sort of reverse competition started to dominate an industry, and the deterrents of passive investing think that if the market were mostly index owned, executives might actively work to help their rivals just to see their own paychecks grow. So this is a whole nother webinar, and we'll stop there. But at HIP Investor, CEO pay is something that we pay a lot of attention to. It's, first of all, one of the metrics that we look at in our ratings. It's easy to, anybody can go online and find the current ratios of CEO pay if you're looking at a particular company. Part of the work that we do at HIP is we actually calculate the CEO pay. When you look online, you'll often see what an industry average is compared to a specific company, and we actually drill down to find what the average at that company for workers at that specific company is and compare it to the CEO at that company. We also do the analytics for the annual report, the 100 most overpaid CEOs, which is compiled by As You Sow, an investor advocacy group. So this was an exciting year for us to do that, since it was the third year that we did that. You can see with the chart here, we actually were able to look not just at the numbers for this year, but we were able to look at it over time. And we did confirm that companies with a CEO pay that's out of line of their peers could be a major drag to shareholder value. The 10 most overpaid CEOs underperform the S&P 500 index by 10.5 percentage points in the last 2 years, while the total shareholder return of these companies, which includes the stock gains and losses and the reinvested dividends, declined by 5.7%. So if you want a copy of that report, that's something else that we can send you, and you can read all about Leslie Moonves from CBS and Mark Benioff from Salesforce. So besides passive investing and active investing, You can also use an enhanced passive strategy, which is where you add, in some cases you can add another layer of screening to a passive strategy, so you aren't just completely mimicking an index, but you aren't using some of the active techniques that I discussed, like hedging and some of the more advanced stock buying strategies. So the HIP 100, which Danielle will actually be talking about in a bit, falls into this category. And what happens when you incorporate impact? So what are the best practices for, as we've been discussing here, taking the emotion out of your investment decisions that's going to negatively affect your performance, but letting you act in your best interest and still preserving your own values and keeping the emotion of what you care about in your investing. So surprise, surprise, we are big proponents of incorporating these screens into your investment. And there's more and more data showing you that you don't have to sacrifice financial performance for social and environmental impact, which unfortunately has been a myth that has plagued the industry for a long time. This chart here is showing a Harvard study that compares companies with high sustainability to companies with low sustainabilities. And the companies with high sustainability significantly outperform their counterparts, and both in terms of stock market as well as accounting performance. There is also a great meta study that collects over 2,000 different studies that have been done that found that 90% of those studies did not see a negative relationship between these ESG factors and corporate financial performance. And more significantly, the vast majority of those studies reported positive findings, and the positive ESG impact on financial performance appears to be stable over time. So incorporating asset allocation as well as incorporating ESG screenings can help balance the risk and reward in your portfolio. Everyone's individual goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon are different. So you, of course, depending on what you're saving for, how old you are, how many years you have to retirement, what your specific mix of asset allocation is going to be personal to you. But we are going to go through different asset classes. We're going to go through some equity, some fixed income, and some cash, and just give some highlights of different options that are out there. So this is a spotlight on ETHO Capital. Their flagship offering is the ETHO Climate Leadership Index. ETHO is the first broad-based, diversified, socially responsible, and fossil fuel-free exchange-traded fund that does not have exposure to the energy sector. This index is completely divested of fossil fuel companies, as well as those in tobacco, weapons, gambling, and it undergoes rigorous screening with expertise from global NGO partners and based on ESG performance data. ETHO Capital's investment thesis is that investment strategies that incorporate ESG sustainability in smart, skilled ways will be more competitive and produce better returns over time. So when compared to, if you look on the left-hand side, when compared to the S&P 500 index, the ETHO Climate Leadership ETF has 85% less greenhouse gas emissions, with only 565 million metric tons, which is from both scope 1, 2, and 3, which measures companies' direct, indirect, and supply chain output. This also shows their financial returns over time. And they also look at carbon intensity, so the ratio of GHG emissions to the market capitalization. and it delivers a 50% reduction from the benchmark S&P 500 index and a 70% reduction from the equally weighted S&P 500 index. So because ETHO weighs its components equally, taking the S&P 500 and instead of how it actually is, which is market weighted, looking at it with an equal weight with all of those companies is actually a more accurate comparison. And next is the Parnassus Endeavor Fund, which was previously called the Parnassus Workplace Fund. It's a mutual fund that invests exclusively in large American firms proven to have outstanding workplaces. The idea was to create a fund that only invested in organizations where employees were really happy. So back in 1998, Milton Moskowitz and his associate Robert Levering oversaw the production of the first best companies to work for list ever published in Fortune magazine. And Russell Investments, the publishers of the Russell 2000 Index, performed an investment return analysis of all of the 100 best companies to work for and proved that it was phenomenal and much better than the S&P index, which is one, of course, of the most commonly used benchmarks for the overall US stock market. To get the fund going, Jerome Dotson, who you can see his picture right here in San Francisco in front of the Ferry Building, and his firm invested $600,000 and solicited investors and other Parnassus funds to contribute more. And they believe that treating people well and authentically respecting them does lead to far better business performance. So Dotson spent his time scouring the country for companies that had built solid reputations for treating employees with profound respect and which supported them through going through ongoing training and personal development. And other important characteristics of firms Dotson and Emily selected is they provided some meaningful form of profit sharing, healthcare, and retirement benefits while being especially supportive of working mothers. He found that many of the firms among the 100 best companies to work for listed and discovered others that had never submitted documentation to be considered an outstanding workplace, but still met the criteria. And ultimately, he chose companies like Intel, Google, Charles Schwab, Microsoft, and then just waited to see how they financially perform. So initially, many business leaders dismissed Moskowitz's earliest list of best places to work. And the San Francisco Chronicle even described it as being a beauty contest that didn't matter to anyone outside of corporate personal development back in a 1997 article. But Moskowitz and soon after Dotson have gone on to prove that leaders at organizations which ensure employees feel valued, supported, developed, and rewarded are amongst the most enlightened. And that's something I think we see in study after study, that workers, especially millennial workers, say that they want in a workplace. So they've helped inspired a greatly expanded bottom line, like we study at Presidio. And of course, this chart here, the financial performance really speaks for itself. The fund has produced a 13% annualized returns over the past decade versus 8% for the S&P 500 index. And the Parnassus Endeavor Fund tops not just the socially responsible funds and sustainable funds, but all US diversified equity funds with at least $1 billion.
Thanks, Megan, and hi everyone. I'm gonna take it from here. So at HIP Investor, we actually have a strategy with a very similar investment thesis, and that's to invest in companies who treat their employees well. So we do this by aggregating all the publicly traded companies on the Fortune 100 Best Places to Work list, We map existing information about their sustainability and business fundamentals using the HIP ratings for each firm. And so this strategy typically invests in 35 to 55 companies, depending on how many public companies manage to qualify for the Fortune 100 Best Places to Work list. The investment process weighs higher HIP-rated securities with a higher weight and lower HIP-rated securities with a lesser weight. And essentially, this process prioritizes fundamentals-based weighting over traditional market cap weighting. And we believe this can better capture the future risks and rewards, ultimately producing what could be a more resilient, forward-looking portfolio. The higher HIP ratings represent firms that are actively addressing social and environmental impact associated with their products and services, as well as their day-to-day operations. So highly rated firms tend to be more innovative rather than extractive in their use of human and natural resources. And by adhering to the human needs of their various stakeholders, highly rated firms are often able to better manage future risks and potentially produce higher financial returns. And so in the next slide, you can see some of our analysis that we look at for each of the impact categories that Megan mentioned. These are our HIP pillars. For example, you can see Whole Foods, a top performer in the health HIP pillar, and maybe not for the reasons you're initially thinking. Of course, Whole Foods has a mission to provide customers with opportunities to increase their health across a variety of goods that they offer. But at HIP, what we're really looking at is the overall well-being of their employees, their customers, and other stakeholders. And we do this by evaluating measures such as employee and customer satisfaction rates, employee attrition rates, and we're definitely interested to see how these measures may shift after the Amazon acquisition. So stay tuned, we'll be looking at that. And you can see some of the other high achievers in this portfolio, such as Allianz, who does really well in the equality category. They have, at Allianz, 53% of all their employees are women, and about a third of their board members are women. So this positions them as leaders in these categories. And 1/3 women on the board might not seem very great, but it's actually about double the average of public US companies. So pretty impressive, all things considered. And then celebrating its 8th year anniversary this year is the HIP 100 portfolio. So this is a large cap index portfolio that re-weights the S&P 100 firms according to their HIP rating. And this is, as we've said, based on core environmental, social, and governance practices measured through a systemic analysis of more than 30 criteria. So basically, instead of the weights being determined by the cap sizes of these companies as they are in the S&P 100 index, this investment strategy overweights companies who are bringing products to the market that benefit customers and society, counting quantifiable human impacts and directly linking these to profit and embedding leading management practices. And it underweights companies who are not doing those things and who are often operating on extractive business models. This strategy was built 8 years ago as a case study on our HIP ratings to show that incorporating quantifiable sustainability measures into the portfolio construction process can produce favorable results, possibly through a reduction of risk, increase in return, or even both. And as you can see, this simple change in how the companies in the S&P 100 are weighted has historically produced favorable results over the last 8 years. And in fact, for this strategy and for some of our others, we're excited to have been recognized in a list of top ESG-focused funds. This list, which was published by Wealth Management Magazine, recently looked at top performing SRI and ESG managers over the past 5 years. So ClearBridge, HIP, and CALVERT are among the top 3 performers, and along with some of the others, beat the S&P 500 based on 5 years of return, risk, and risk-return ratios as of March of this year. And now we're going to jump into the world of fixed income. So a separate asset class from equities. And we're starting with a spotlight on CALVERT investments. So CALVERT, recently acquired by Eaton Vance, is an investment management firm focused on their mission of stewarding capital responsibly. And so their approach includes analyzing companies based on financial and non-financial information that includes various ESG factors. They focus on finding companies that are creating positive impact in society while, of course, producing competitive investment returns. CALVERT has a number of funds that can be invested in, but today, in particular, we're highlighting their Green Bond Fund. So for those of you who may not be familiar, green bonds are designated according to the Green Bond Principles, which is a set of guidelines that promote transparency and disclosure around the use of funds for some type of sustainability project. So the bonds in the CALVERT Green Bond Fund includes those issued by companies that are developing or providing products and services to provide environmental solutions or to support environmental projects. So this might include projects such as installation of gray water systems, rooftop solar installation, or even, the construction of a new LEED certified building on campus for a company. Another type of impactful fixed income solution comes from community capital management. They were founded in 1998 to provide investment management services to institutions and individuals through mutual funds and separate accounts. Since they were started, they've managed market rate fossil fuel-free impact investments totaling over $7.9 billion nationwide. And so their CRA qualified investment fund began 10 years ago. It's comprised of investments deemed to meet the qualifications of the Community Reinvestment Act, which was intended to encourage banks and other savings institutions to make investments that help meet the criteria, the credit needs of the communities in which they operate. And this includes low and moderate income neighborhoods. So for CCM, this fund has been responsible for the creation of almost 400,000 affordable rental housing units, almost $900 million invested in home ownership and down payment assistance, about $33 million invested in affordable healthcare and rehab facilities across their portfolio. They have some other really great impact measurements on this fund. And a couple sample investments. One includes a loan to Elizabeth Seton Pediatric Center that helped finance the construction and expansion of the center to accommodate 32 additional children who are dependent on ventilators. It was a 3-story addition to their facilities that also included more classrooms to educate the children the extra children that could be accommodated for with the expansion. And since the expansion, they've also hired more than 100 new employees and have been awarded a LEED Gold certification on the building. Another type of investment that this fund supports is through Opportune, which is a community development financial institution that's really near and dear to my heart. They have a mission to provide affordable loans to underserved Hispanic communities and other communities with little or no credit history. They've provided over 1.5 million loans to their customers, 90% of whom live in low to moderate income neighborhoods. And their customers have saved an estimated $345 million in interest and fees by borrowing from Opportune instead of choosing other alternatives typically available to people with limited credit history. Their loans are usually used for things like repurchasing and repairing cars, building credit, consolidating debts, assisting loved ones, and used in medical and other emergencies. So really cool projects through this fund. And then a great firm worth mentioning is Neighborly.com. They're an online investment platform focused on modernizing public finance. The New York Times described them as putting the public back in public finance. They're a registered broker-dealer, and their all-in-one services dramatically cut the costs required for cities, schools, and other municipalities to issue bonds, which is great. And at the same time, their online platform better allows everyday investors to find and invest in municipal bond projects. They're lowering bond denominations to be as low as $500 for individual investors, which greatly increases accessibility for most investors. And their platform makes it easier to find bonds in your own communities. So Neighborly thinks of muni bonds as the original social impact investments, and they have been used to finance schools, parks, and even the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is pretty cool. Their goal is to democratize the $3.8 trillion municipal securities market, and in doing so, foster a healthier relationship between global banks and the communities of our country. Of course, if you're interested in adding muni bonds to your portfolio, definitely consult with your financial advisor prior to investing to understand how these tax-free securities can fit in with your overall investment strategy. And of course, there are opportunities for impact even in your cash holdings. So if you attended our first webinar, or if you go back and watch it, you might remember our conversation regarding what kind of investments your bank might be making with your deposits and whether or not those are investments that you'd like to support. Particularly, we highlighted which banks were invested in DAPL and other pipeline projects. So rewatch that webinar or refer to the resource handout that we provided to learn more about how to find sustainable banking institutions like these that might be better aligned with your values. And then an additional alternative to keeping your cash in a bank account is to use a savings product like C-Note. So C-Note is currently offering 2.5% interest on your deposits, which blows most savings accounts out of the water. And on top of that, 100% of your dollars are invested to drive community impact by funding community development projects, including investments in minority and women-led businesses that are often overlooked by traditional lending institutions. So you can go to their site and see a projection of how much you could save and gain with interest, and what type of impact would be had with your deposits. So just to summarize some of the investments we've highlighted today, of course, there are many exciting impact-focused investment products across these and other asset classes. This is a summary just of the case study we highlighted today. And of course, keep in mind that this information has all been provided for educational purposes, and any investment considerations should be made with your investment advisor. And to bring it back to the impact spectrum that we started with, so hopefully you can already identify where various investments fit in the spectrum. And fortunately, the landscape is continuing to evolve every day. New impact investment opportunities are continually being brought to the market. Even just a few years ago, it was much harder for an individual investor to create a diversified impact portfolio across asset classes. And there's still a broad spectrum of impact and a lot of terminology and acronyms to sift through, but there are more and more products available for everyday investors. So whether you're looking to invest for the first time, you're on the board of a foundation, or you're directing institutional dollars, or you just have a bank account, you can help shift capital to more sustainable opportunities. And at Presidio Graduate School, we speak a lot about social enterprises, benefit corporations, more traditional C Corps who are just coming around to focus on sustainability across all these sectors, and particularly possibly in finance. It's going to take a lot of work and innovation to make a material shift from one end of the spectrum to the other. Especially in financial services, there are hundreds of years of infrastructure supporting the extractive and destructive end of the spectrum. And these systems are deeply ingrained in our economies and in our culture, which is why it takes real system thinkers to crack the code on how to alter their system and shift it for the better. And with that, we'd love to open it up for questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, or enter it into the chat box if you'd like.
Thank you, Danielle and Megan. We're going to open up for questions. I also wanted to share with all of you, I'm going to put in the chat box a link to a a blog article and Presidio.edu, which highlights a little bit about Megan and her background, and also has a recording of our first webinar in case you missed that.
Great. So Adam asked for a link to these studies, and Adam, there's nothing that makes me happier than sending links to the studies that I referred to. So I can definitely, yeah, make sure that you get those links.
Thank you.
For current students at Presidio, we just want to do a little plug for the Impact Investing Club, which is being led this year by David Sugar, a current Presidian and also a member here on the HIP Investor team. And prospective students, keep an eye on the club and see what kind of interesting events that they're hosting that you might be able to participate in.
Thanks, Danielle, for bringing that up. And yeah, Megan and I are thinking about co-hosting an event with Mindful Money and the Impact Investing Club on October 19th. So we can send more information about that to come. So look forward to working with you all on impact investing.
No other questions? Does that mean we did a great job?
Yeah, so there's a lot of information. It probably is going to take a little bit to digest. Also, right now, besides questions, if anyone has any ideas about what to talk about in the final webinar, throw them out right now. I had someone suggest sustainable 401ks as a potential option. In the last webinar, someone suggested talking about shareholder advocacy. So is there anything that somebody logged onto this call thinking that they really wanted to go over that we didn't cover that we could potentially cover in the next one? Jeremy, you look like you're deep in thought. You have any ideas?
Well, I am very interested in loco vesting, but I'm not certain if that really aligns with this case. And I don't know if we have anyone who can speak to loco vesting as well.
Yeah, place-based, I think that's a great idea. We can, I mean, as far as getting into that right now in the Q&A, it might be a little bit much, but we'll definitely add that to the poll for the next, the next call to talk about place-based investing and local investing. We've done some work in the past with Lauren Agnew, and she has actually an alliance here in the Bay Area that has focused on doing exactly that. So that's something that it's the Bay Area Impact Investing Initiative. And that's something that you can definitely check out, and we'll put on the list to potentially go into a lot more. But that's also another good point that, when it talks, every single person has different, not only a different risk return profile, but different impact goals. So what one person might want to try to make their portfolio completely Bay Area focused, another person might have different ideas. So I'll definitely add that to the list for the next one.
And keep in mind that you can ask any questions here at all. Any questions about HIP Investor, anything about Presidio Graduate School. I mean, we're open here to sort of broaden out the topics here. Just something that maybe piqued your interest. Be great to hear. Maybe Megan or Danielle, you could talk a little bit about what HIP Investor is and sort of how you got involved with HIP Investor.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I'll take it, Megan.
Great.
Yeah, so HIP Investor is a financial research institution, primarily providing these HIP ratings and measures of sustainability of different investment types. On top of that, we have investment strategies that you can invest in, and we do portfolio consulting as well. So we have worked with endowments and foundations and family offices to help green up their portfolio. So I think we had a question in the very beginning about that. And I discovered impact investing while at Presidio and sort of made it my mission while I was there to really understand the landscape and find places that I might be able to fit into it. Was introduced to Paul, our CEO, who's also on the webinar, through a Presidian, and have been here ever since for about 2 years now.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, and my career has been was in the traditional financial services, and that's actually why I went back to Presidio, because I wanted to make a transition into sustainable investing and into impact investing. So that was my focus when I was in school, and I'm not sure the first time that I met Paul or learned about HIP, but it definitely was at Presidio Graduate School. He was a speaker in my capital markets class, and so I had been, very aware of what HIP was doing, because I was trying to pay attention to all of the thought leaders in the industry. And after I graduated, I started speaking to Paul at an ESG happy hour networking event about some of the projects that HIP was working on, and it seemed very in line with what I wanted to focus on. So I started working at HIP. My interest being at Presidio had really started as purely impact investing, and I got a lot more interested in financial technology and how you can use technology just to help people simplify their decisions. So since at HIP, I've worked on creating a partnership with another company, a financial technology startup, Money Intelligence, that helps provide really simple 401ks for clients. And we're working now where you can set up a 401k and immediately go in, answer a questionnaire, it assigns what your risk tolerance is, and then shows you what suggested portfolio you would want. We're doing a lot with push button fossil fuel-free portfolios. So a lot of people are really excited to be able to log onto a portfolio, get their risk tolerance taken care of, get invested the way that they appropriately should be, and then also see the HIP score of their portfolio, see how, whether it's extractive or not, see the fossil fuel exposure in their portfolio if that's one of their impact goals. So that's been a great project to work on. Great. Well, if anyone, this final slide, of course, has everyone's email on it, but we have some good suggestions for the next one. Local vesting, place-based investing, sustainable 401ks. So it's going to be, I was going to say last call for ideas, but if you don't want to say it on the call right now, we'll let you just email it out to us afterwards, and we'll hold off for a couple days, just so if anyone thinks of something that they really want to cover on the next event, we can include it in the survey, and we'll send that out to everyone next week.
Great, that sounds great. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Danielle. Paul, did you want to add anything since you're on the call here? To put you on the spot.
You're on mute, Paul, so you'll have to unmute.
There we go. There we go. I think you're unmuted now.
Nope, just really excited about the opportunity to do, for everybody to do more investing with impact, especially as companies like Vanguard and BlackRock and State Street are starting to use their proxy power to have ExxonMobil disclose emissions and what they're doing on climate action. State Street, next to the statue of a bull on Wall Street, created a statue of a young girl to sort of show the strength of women and women investing. And Vanguard, the CEO, is now getting more engaged on being a caretaker of long-term investing to represent the millions of people who are invested in Vanguard. So good news is that impact investing and sustainable investing is on the upswing, and glad that the whole community of Presidio, including Megan and Danielle, and David can lead the way in being a force for good. So it's your money, vote with your money, and however you allocate it, hold your investees and your advisors and your fund managers and your 401ks accountable for delivering impact as well as financial return.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate that. Danielle, Megan, always a pleasure. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and conclude this presentation. However, feel free to reach out to myself. My contact information is there, or Megan and Danielle. If you have any more further questions, you want to have more of an in-depth conversation, happy to help with that. And look out for a survey as well as the recording of today's webinar, and give us those ideas for our final third part in this 3-part series. Thank you so much, and hope to be hearing from you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.